Okay, now we get the gospel reading, which is going to be super fun, actually, because we're going to get a chance to just take a look at something that I think can be a common area of struggle between Catholic Christians, and non-Catholic Christians, which is just going to be great. And it's going to seem like, as at first blush, I don't really know what that phrase means, but at first reading, I suppose, it's going to seem like the non-Catholics have it out for us. They have a good point. So let's jump in. So this comes from Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. And then we jump to verses 14 through 15, which is actually not helpful. But anyway, let's jump from there to 21 through 23. And what's not helpful is I wish we just read the whole thing straight through. But this is already a pretty long gospel passage. And so maybe there's reason for not reading the whole thing. Don't know. Let's jump in, though. Okay. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites. As it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts.' You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition." He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." Okay, so this, like I said, this is gonna be actually really good. So let me just let's catch up here. So we spent the last 5 weeks in John chapter 6. Before John chapter 6, we read about Jesus sending out the disciples, the mission, giving the apostles this mission to go and preach and teach, and then they come back and Jesus calls them to rest a while, and that's kind of where they end up. And then we jumped into John 6 with the feeding of the 5,000, and then the whole bread of life discourse. So now we're jumping back in, and ultimately all we skip in Mark's gospel is the feeding of the 5,000, which we got already, of course. We skip over the walking on the water, which amazingly enough, we actually didn't get during our 5-week series, but it is also included in John chapter 6. It's kind of, I don't really know why it's not included in our lectionary, but it's not. But it is in John 6, so we didn't actually skip over that part. And then there's healings that take place, which is just a bunch of healings. Like Jesus performs miracles. Oh, he just performs a few miracles here. Well, I guess it's a big deal, but for some reason we skip right over it and jump into this thing where the Pharisees and the scribes. So who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees. So within the Jewish faith, there are different groups. So there's the Pharisees, the Sadducees. There's another group actually that is not really mentioned in the Gospels, but they're the Essenes. And it's actually understood that John the Baptist perhaps was a member of the Essene group, and those were maybe the most intense of the groups as far as prayer and fasting goes, and that kind of thing. John was, he's in the desert. He was eating just locusts and wild honey, that kind of thing. The Pharisees had this mentality among them of following the law, which is not a bad thing. Actually, we talked about this in the first reading, about how the Lord commands through Moses, he commands to observe these laws carefully. Who is the one who will dwell with the Lord, but the one who thinks the truth in his heart. They're seeking to walk blamelessly and to do justice. So that's who the Pharisees are. We tend to think of them as like the bad guys. They're not actually the bad guys. They're kind of seen to be righteous men, righteous people. And what's more, as I just heard this actually this week, that the Pharisees, one of their goals is to try to remember the temple all the time. And what is the temple? The temple is the place of sacrifice. It is the place of worship of God. In the synagogues, they can study Torah, and they can read the scriptures and hear preaching, and that's really great. But it is in the temple that's where the sacrificial worship takes place, which is at the heart of covenants, at the heart of worship, sacrifice. So it's actually like kind of a neat thing to think about. What if we thought of Mass, or tried to do everything we could to think about Mass often? And so for that matter, the way that they help themselves to think about these things included taking on some of the ritual things that had to take place going into the temple and bringing them into their everyday life. So before a priest could go into the temple and offer worship, there were basins of water that they had to wash their hands and their feet in, actually. Like, this was a requirement. It's given in the book of Exodus, as I think Exodus, for sure Leviticus, but maybe both. So there were basins of water that they'd wash themselves in before they could enter into the temple as a way of purification. So when it talks about the Pharisees and the scribes observing that Jesus and his disciples eat their meals with unclean hands and unwashed hands, well, this is actually breaking from what they did. Actually, is that they took this ritual of needing to cleanse themselves before going to worship, and they said, okay, well, let's wash our hands before we do important things in our daily lives, like eating or whatever. Like so we want to try to bring this habit into our lives in such a way that when we do it, we remember the temple. And so now when you see people doing this and breaking with the custom of what we've been doing, well, it seems like they're intentionally trying to forget the temple. It seems like they're intentionally trying to forget worship. And what's more, it seems like they're trying to usurp your leadership in a kind of way, or just ignore your leadership in kind of a way. So that's actually a really, really important thing. And that's why, so here's another kind of a neat thing here. So Mark, he's writing to mostly a Gentile audience, whereas Matthew's gospel is written to mostly a Jewish audience. So Matthew's gospel is written to people that would understand why the Pharisees wash their hands before everything that they do. Mark, writing to a non-Jewish, a Gentile audience, they wouldn't understand the reason of the washing of whatever. And so Mark just takes a little bit of time and he says, okay, well, the Pharisees and the Jews, in fact, all of them, they don't eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things they've traditionally observed. So all these different things. So Mark just tries to explain it like this is actually a big deal, that the Pharisees are seeing that there are some Jews, some Jewish men, who don't wash their hands before eating or before doing these things. And they're led by someone who calls himself a rabbi, or who is called a rabbi. So that's like, okay, well, what in the world is going on? Everyone else is doing this. Why aren't you doing this? And so they ask him, like, why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands? So the Pharisees are getting all uppity about, like, okay, well, we've got this tradition. Why don't you follow it? So what is the word tradition? So the word tradition in Greek, it basically means that it is tradition that is handed on, something that is a handing over of certain things. So in other words, like this habit of washing before meals, it's not written in the law of Moses. The only time that is required to wash is before entering into the temple. So this isn't in the law of Moses, but we're handing this over anyways. And so there's an expectation from the Pharisees' perspective that they need to follow this. And what is Jesus' response? His response is quoting Isaiah, which talks about hypocrites. So Jesus again responds. They get really uppity about it, and Jesus responds with a certain measure of intensity, actually, where he says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine human precepts." So Jesus here is like, okay, well, let's understand this. There's doctrine and there are human precepts. And there's probably technical definitions that we have in our modern day for what these things are. But as Jesus quotes this passage, he's saying doctrines come from God and precepts come from man. And so Isaiah is saying, and therefore Jesus is saying, that there are people teaching precepts that come from man as though they come from God. And so if you break these things that come from man, even though they didn't come from God, if you break these things, you're actually committing a grave sin. And so what does he say? You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition. Okay, so now, before we get into the next part, this is where many Protestant Christians will point to us Catholics, and for that matter, maybe not just us Catholics, but I think especially us Catholics, and they will say, you Catholics have all of these man-made traditions and man-made laws. Don't you know that Jesus teaches to not do that? Don't you know that he goes against those things? And so then for us as Catholic Christians, if we're unfamiliar with what follows, we can feel like we're kind of stuck. Like, gosh, maybe he does teach that. And here I am part of a religion that is going against it, which means Catholicism must not be true. It must not be right. And so I better leave. I'm quite confident that there are many Catholics who just didn't know their Bible very well that left Catholicism because of this argument, because they didn't have an answer. And to be sure, like, it seems like a really strong argument that Jesus is talking about this, like, disregard. But the key here is what? It is disregarding the commandments while clinging to tradition. Jesus is not saying that human tradition is a bad thing. In fact, this is a really important thing. So there's going to be a couple of really important things here. This is one of them. In fact, Jesus himself endorses human tradition in at least a couple, but probably more often than just a couple of different instances. In one of those instances, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus speaks about the Pharisees taking Moses' seat, or the seat of Moses, the chair of Moses. What is the chair of Moses? Well, as the Jewish tradition developed, or the Jewish religion developed, there began to be this seat that a leading Pharisee would take and use it as a place of authority. This is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. And yet Jesus is saying they take their seat on the chair of Moses, but they act they act inappropriately, and yet do what they say, do everything that they say. So I should have just looked this up. Matthew chapter 23, right at the beginning. This is so important. Jesus says, the scribes and Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example, for they preach, but they do not practice. So Jesus is giving legitimacy to the authority of what? Of the chair of Moses, which is not found in the Bible. So this is a human tradition that has developed over time as a way for the leaders to express or to exercise their authority. And Jesus is saying, do whatever they say. Follow it. Follow the authority that they've taken upon themselves. That sounds like an endorsement of a human tradition. And what's more, so at the Passover meal, what happens? Over time, there's a tradition that develops, a script that develops, where it says the leader of the meal says this, and then he takes a cup of wine. Whereas if you look at the first Passover meal, there are no instructions about drinking wine during the meal. And yet, at the time of Jesus, if someone was participating in the Passover meal and did not drink the wine that was prescribed as part of the script, then it was understood that that person did not celebrate the Passover. And we know that Jesus, at the Last Supper, of course, he has all of the things for the meal, but then what's more, he has a cup of wine, a chalice of wine, at least one, but probably he had 4 chalices of wine there at the meal. So in other words, he was following the tradition of the elders, actually. So for people to argue that Jesus is saying we shouldn't follow any man-made traditions is totally false, actually. It is totally false. What is Jesus getting at? So that's the first important thing. What is Jesus getting at then? What is the thing that he's actually arguing against? The thing that he's arguing against is this: you disregard God's commandment but cling to human tradition. And this is the part that we skip over a bunch of verses, and I wish that we didn't, because it gives examples. Jesus gives examples of what he's talking about. He talks about how that Moses gave a commandment to honor your father and your mother. So this is a commandment. And the Jewish understanding was that it wasn't just like to honor them with words, but to honor them also with actions. That as your parents got elderly, you were to support them and care for them, even provide for them if necessary. And so Jesus is saying, whoever curses father and mother shall die. Honor your father and mother. Yet you say, so then he says to them, if a person says to father or mother, any support you might have had from me is korban, meaning dedicated to God, you allow him to do nothing more for his father or mother. So in other words, they had established a law, a tradition, that instead of supplying and providing for their elderly parents, they could make an offering to God, and they were saying that was okay. So in other words, they established a law, a tradition, a man-made tradition that undercut the laws of God. And it allowed the people a way to what? To avoid following the commandments of God. Remember what the Lord said in the first reading. He said, do not add and do not subtract. And do not add and do not subtract in such a way that it prevents you or gives you an excuse to avoid the law. Okay, so anyway, so Jesus is getting at this reality of not undercutting the laws of God. So if our traditions don't undercut the laws of God, but actually support us following the laws of God, then that's actually a good thing. That is to be encouraged, in fact. So anyway, so that is really big. Okay, now let's go on. So then he summons the crowd. And he tells them, okay, here's the deal. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile, but instead, those that come from within to the outside, those are what defile. So this is actually big because in the next part that we skip over, it actually says that Jesus, he declares all foods clean. So that's actually a big deal. So again, some people will say, well, why don't you follow the food laws of the Old Covenant? Well, because Jesus declares all foods to be clean. And then he goes on to say, well, from within people, from their hearts come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within and they defile. So there's this reality of Jesus is like, okay, your moral life, the way that you live, which flows from within you, that is what defiles you. That's again so big. So what are some of these things? So evil thoughts. I think this is actually a really important point to make. So what are the evil thoughts that Jesus is talking about? Because I know that I sometimes can have involuntary thoughts that just come into my mind that are like, gosh, I shouldn't have thought that, or I shouldn't think this, or I shouldn't, whatever. Jesus, this word evil thoughts, it is implying voluntary plans or designs. So the person, not who says, gosh, I wish I didn't think about this thing, but the person who says, oh, I'm thinking about this and I'm actually going to plan for it. I'm going to plan to go out and have too good of a time. I'm going to plan to get together with someone who's not my spouse and have too good of a time. I'm going to plan to do this thing. I'm going to plan to do that thing. So that is what he's talking about, this voluntary entertainment of thoughts that are sinful, that are bad. This word unchastity, that word is porneia, which can sound a lot like what? Pornography. So porneia in the scriptures oftentimes or almost always refers to any illicit sexual activity. So not just like adultery that is mentioned separately, but also other illicit sexual activity that take place. Basically any sexual act that is outside the context of marriage. And sometimes even within the context of marriage, there are certain sexual acts that are off limits. So it's like that kind of a thing. Theft, murder, adultery, right? So these all, like, in so many ways, a lot of these go against the commandments, the Decalogue, the 10 commandments of the Lord. Greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness. What is licentiousness? It is perversion, to intentionally disorder things and to be okay with them being disordered. Okay, so all these different things. These, Jesus is saying, our moral life, the way that we live our life, this is what defiles, and that is what needs to be rooted out and cleansed from within us. Ooh, man, that's strong, and yet at the same time, it is so good. Okay, now we gotta prepare ourselves for our next reading, which is gonna be super good as we start a new series in the letter of James. Okay, God bless you.